and this is my town. It's good to be home here. The people who live here are part of my life, and I don't believe...
Behind me, you can see the Wellington Monument in Trim. It's a Corinthian column, 75 feet high, erected in honour of Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, in the year 1817, 2 years after he defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. The monument was erected here because Wellington lived nearby while he was MP for Trim from 1790 to 1795. Where Wellington was actually born is uncertain. Suggestions include the family home in Dangan near Summerhill, their townhouse in Trim, Dublin, and at least 20 other locations, including possibly in a coach on their way from Trim to Dublin. Wellington was British Prime Minister from 1828 to 1830, and again for a very short period in 1834. And as Prime Minister, he oversaw the passage of the Catholic Emancipation Bill in 1829. The column was designed by a local architect, James Bell of Navingate, Trim, and the statue of the Duke is by Cork-born sculptor Thomas Kirk. He also did the statue of Nelson, which was on Nelson's pillar in Dublin. The statue shows the Duke in military uniform with one arm raised in blessing or in triumph. Behind me this week is Newtown Bridge near Trim. It's also known as St. Peter's Bridge. It has 5 arches. I remember back in the 70s there was a suggestion that it should be modified and widened to accommodate more traffic. But many locals objected, and traffic lights were put in instead. The bridge is thought to date at least from the 15th century. And there's the River Boyne, flowing from Trinity Well near Carbery, County Kildare, where it rises, towards Navan, Slane, Drogheda, and into the Irish Sea. Here I am this week beside the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, Newtown, Trim. It was founded close to Trim and Trim Castle by the first Norman Bishop of Meath, Simon de Rochford, in 1206, and it replaced Clonard as the cathedral for Meath diocese. There is a badly worn carving of an ecclesiastic in the cathedral, which some people think might actually be a statue of Simon de Rochford. This was the largest cathedral in medieval Ireland when it was built, and it was built in the Gothic style. Only part of the original nave and chancel survive. In the 16th century, the church was downsized, and parts of the transepts and the aisles were removed, and a new west wall was built. It was in the care of Augustinian monks, and remains of their priory still exist between the cathedral and the River Boyne. Behind me at Newtown Cemetery is the tomb of the jealous man and woman, as it's called locally, which may or may not be a suitable backdrop for a Valentine's Day video. It's actually the resting place of Sir Lucas Dillon and his wife Lady Jane Bath, dating from around 1592. Lucas is in Renaissance armour and his wife is in an Elizabethan gown. Lucas was a leading Irish barrister and judge during the Elizabethan times, and at one stage he was the Attorney General for Ireland. There's a number of theories as to why it's called a jealous man and woman, but the simplest appears to be connected with the fact that there's a sword between the two of them. In fact, the sword might be the sword of state, and it could also represent the finality of death. Lady Jane died some time before Lucas, and he remarried. His second wife, Marian Sherrill, is buried in a similar tomb with her first husband in Lusk, County Dublin. And when Lucas died, he was buried here with his first wife. Behind me is Trim Castle, very familiar to all our viewers. And this fellow is Hugh de Lacy, who built the first castle on the site. Hugh was an Anglo-Norman lord who took part in the Norman invasion of Ireland and was granted in 1172 the lands of Meath by King Henry II. Of course, he then had to take control of them from the native Irish. He built the first castle at Trim, a wooden one, which the Irish, under the High King Rory O'Connor, burned down. Hugh then had that rebuilt and gradually spread the control of the Normans over the lands of Meath. In 1186, Hugh de Lacy was killed while building a castle at Durrow in Offaly. His son Walter succeeded as Lord of Meath, and he continued building the castle until about 1224. The ruins of Trim Castle are one of the glories of beautiful Meath. Behind me you can see a sculpture. It's beside Trim Castle. It was carved by Joey Burns in 2007 from bog oak from a Cavan bog. It's called A Hunger for Knowledge, and it includes a reference to the Salmon of Knowledge story. You all know that old story. The magical salmon of knowledge lived in the River Boyne. A young boy, Finn McCool, tasted it first by accident, and he became wise. He had been helping the old man Finnegas, who had spent years trying to catch the salmon. Fionn later became the famous leader of the Fianna, and there's many Irish tales about him. The sculpture also has references to Ireland's greatest mathematician, William Rowan Hamilton, who from the age of 3 lived in Trim with his uncle James Hamilton, who ran a school in Talbot's Castle, which is the big building beside the yellow steeple. The sculpture has some of Hamilton's mathematical equations carved into it. Your man here, Hugh de Lacy, is at it again. He's just taken over the prime position beside his castle. He's had the Salmon of Knowledge bog oak sculpture that was here moved to a less prominent place. Typical blow-in. He thinks he owns the place. Look at him. Not a patch on the other hero of Trim Castle, Mel Gibson. Hugh, of course, unlike Mel, is dead. He died in 1186, over 800 years ago. We do have a description of him by Gerald the Welshman, if we can trust him. If you wish to know what Hugh's complexion and features were like, he was dark, with dark sunken eyes and flattened nostrils. His face was grossly disfigured down the right side as far as his chin by a burn. That was the result of an accident. He was a short man, misshapen, his body hairy and sinewy. He paid much attention to his own private affairs and was most careful in the administration of the office entrusted to him and his conduct of public affairs. After the death of his wife, he was a womanizer and enslaved by lust, not just for one woman, but for many. He was avaricious and greedy for gold, and more ambitious for his own advancement and preeminence than was proper. That was our Hugh de Lacy. Of course, nowadays, he'd never get planning permission for that big castle. Here we are beside the Russian cannon at Trim Castle. Trim was one of 18 urban councils in Ireland that asked for and got a captured Russian cannon in the late 1850s after the Crimean War. This cannon was originally beside the old county jail and was moved here quite recently. It has the Tsar's coat of arms, the Romanov double-headed eagle. Behind me is the Sheep Gate, the only surviving gate of 5 original gates in the walls of medieval Trim. It was built in the 13th or 14th century. St. Patrick was supposed to have landed at the mouth of the River Boyne at Drogheda, and in 433 AD he sent his friend, a priest, Loman, ahead of him down the river to look for a site for a Christian settlement. And the story goes that Loman landed at Trim, and he met a local chieftain, Phelim, gave him land on the top of a hill on which he built the first Christian church in Trim and in Meath. St. Patrick's Cathedral, behind me, is on the highest point in Trim, and there's evidence from archaeological excavations of a previous church there. So it's probable that this church is built on the site of Loman's first church. This church has been replaced and altered many times since then. The tower at the west end dates from the mid-14th century, and there are ruins from that period behind the present building. In 1803, the church was rebuilt and its size reduced to the present size. On St. Patrick's Day, 1955, the church was elevated to the status of a cathedral. This week, I'm in front of the yellow steeple, which is the remains of the bell tower of St. Mary's Abbey, Trim, an Augustinian abbey dedicated to the Blessed Virgin. This tower is 40 metres high, and the name apparently comes from the yellow colour reflected by the stonework when the sun is setting. It's on the north bank of the River Boyne, opposite Trim Castle. In the Middle Ages, the abbey was a pilgrimage site, famous for the healing power of its statue of the Virgin Mary, Our Lady of Trim. It was dissolved under Henry VIII during the Reformation, and the yellow steeple was supposed to have been partly destroyed by Oliver Cromwell. It's said that the wooden statue of Our Lady of Trim was eventually burned as firewood. You're all welcome again to Trim, or rather to Bective Abbey, which is a few miles outside of Trim. This monastery was founded in 1147 by the Cistercians, and it was the second Cistercian monastery in Ireland. The first was Medley2, which isn't all that far away in County Louth. The remains you can see date mainly from the 13th to the 15th centuries, and they include the church, the chapter house, and the cloisters. Some of the Gothic arches of the cloisters still remain in very good condition, and they're one of the features of the monastery. The monastery was suppressed by Henry VIII at the time of the suppression of the monasteries, and it was rented out to a landowner who turned it into a fortified house. Bective Abbey has been used at least 3 times as a location for Hollywood films. In 1955, it was used for part of Captain Lightfoot, which starred Rock Hudson. In 1995, parts of Braveheart were shot here. And in 2020, Ridley Scott filmed some of his medieval epic, The Last Duel, here at Bective Abbey. With its many rooms and stairs and hiding places, Bective Abbey has also been a favourite playground for children over the years. Talbot's castle behind me in Trim is a fortified manor house, probably built in 1450, and it may have used part of St. Mary's Augustinian Abbey, which had been on the same site. It may even have been part of the abbey's refectory or dining hall. The yellow steeple beside it was part of that abbey. This manor was the stately home of Sir John Talbot, who at that time was the Viceroy of Ireland, and that's why it's called Talbot's Castle. The Talbot coat of arms can be seen on the north wall. Talbot fought in the wars with France, and in 1429 he was defeated in Orleans by the French, who were led by Joan of Arc. In the early 18th century, Esther Johnson bought the manor for £65 sterling and lived there for 18 months. She was one of Jonathan Swift's female friends. He called her Stella. She later sold it to Swift, who at that time was the rector in Larracar, which is just outside Trim. In the 18th and 19th century, this building was the diocesan school, and both the future Duke of Wellington and the famous mathematician Rowan Hamilton studied here. Behind these walls on the Summerhill Road, Trim, is the Castle Arch Hotel. It's built on the site of the old Royal Irish Constabulary, that's the RIC barracks. This was originally built as a military barracks and was occupied by various regiments of the British Army. That's the reason for the high walls around it and the large iron gates. These weren't typical of RIC barracks. In the middle of the 19th century, it was converted into an RIC barracks and it became the RIC headquarters for County Meath. In September 1920, during the War of Independence, the IRA raided the barracks. They captured 8 policemen as they attended Mass, and then they overpowered the rest of the garrison. They set the barracks alight and it was completely gutted. Following this, military and police terrorised the town, burning several shops and businesses as a reprisal. One of the most impressive buildings in Trim is the courthouse, often ignored because it's so familiar, standing as it does at the end of Market Street, the main street of the town. It was built around 1810, designed by Cork-born architect Richard Morrison, who studied under James Gandon, the architect who built so many of the great buildings of Dublin. A major refurbishment project was completed in 2001. This involved the renovation and restoration of the old courthouse and the addition of an extension. The refurbished courthouse was officially opened in July 2001. The architects were Newnham, Mulligan and Associates. They won a top prize in the 2001 Building of the Year award. Talking of Trim Courthouse extension, the jury said that it had an expressive contemporary design and avoided any banal mimicking pastiche of the restored older building. It is fair to say that there were mixed opinions as to the design of the extension, but it does now seem to be accepted as an interesting addition to the buildings of Trim. Here I am at the newest bridge in Trim, Watergate Bridge, opened in 2005. It has a span of 35 metres and you can see it has low metal arches and there are walkways on each side. This bridge replaced what was the first bridge on this site, built in 1904, Watergate Bridge, which was always known as the New Bridge. Before that, there was only one bridge in Trim, which was called the Old Bridge. Of course, there's another new bridge in Trim now, out on the Ring Road, built in the 1980s. So terms like New Bridge and Old Bridge can be very confusing in a town. The old Watergate Bridge of 1904 was an interesting structure with 4 cast iron spans resting on 3 concrete piers in the river. It was built by Collins and Newman contractors, and the design was by the Meath County surveyor of the time, Joseph Henry Moore, who had been born in London but came to live in Ireland at a young age. This photograph, which I got from Anne Crinion, may actually show work on finishing the 1904 bridge. And before the Boyne was drained in the early 70s, the area around the bridge was often flooded. And this is a photograph from 1965, which again I got from Anne Crinion, showing flooding. The building behind me now holds a tourist office and visitor centre in Trim, though it's still often referred to as the Town Hall because of its former function. This flat-roofed 2-storey building was built in 1925 to replace the Town Hall, which was burned by the British forces after the IRA capture and burning of their barracks in September 1920. This new Town Hall was opened on August the 30th, 1925 with an all-night dance. The offices of Trim Urban Council were on the top floor, and the ground floor had a dance hall and was also used for showing films and for drama and musical productions. By the early 50s, it was considered unsuitable, and a large extension was built parallel to it. And this was officially opened with a dance on the 17th of March 1952. And this dance was from 10 p.m. until 4 a.m. This continued in use as a dance hall and a venue for productions by Trim musical and drama societies until quite recently, when it was deemed unsuitable. At present, a performance space is included as part of the new state-of-the-art library and cultural centre being constructed in High Street, and this should open early next year. And there's also plans for a refurbishment of this Town Hall tourist office building. This is the old rectory in Lomond Street, Trim, one of the oldest continuously inhabited buildings in Trim. It was erected in 1751 opposite St. Patrick's Church, and it was the residence of the Church of Ireland clergyman. There have been many alterations, of course, since 1751 in the building. The house had extensive formal gardens, which are now occupied by a housing estate, and it had stables and a coach house, which is where the new parish school was built fairly recently. The best remembered resident was Dean Richard Butler, who collected and published much of the history of Trim. He lived there from 1819 until his death in 1861. His large box tomb is in the churchyard nearby, and the clock on the church tower is a memorial to him. In 1955, a new rectory was built opposite the church, and the old rectory was converted into flats, with the boardroom continuing to be used by the parish for vestry meetings and for other parochial meetings. For some years, Martina Quinn operated a Montessori school in the building. More recently, Sandy McNally has turned it into a guest house and a vintage tea rooms. This is Black Friary Trim, named for the medieval Dominican friary which once stood here just outside the walls of Trim. The Dominican friars wore black habits. This is the site of the Black Friary Community Heritage and Archaeology Project, run by the Black Friary Archaeology Field School. Excavations have been running here each summer since 2010, and international students work and study here. Visitors and enthusiasts are also welcome, and free tours are available during the summer. This Dominican friary was founded in 1263 by Geoffrey de Geneville, who was an Anglo-French noble who married one of the de Lacys. He was a soldier and statesman, and a friend of Henry III and Edward I, kings of England. He took part in the 8th Crusade. In later life, he retired to this friary and he was buried here in 1314. The friary was suppressed by Henry VIII in 1542. Later, the stone from the old buildings were removed for building stone, but the site was never built over, and so much of the foundations of the friary survive. It was a very large site, with a great church and a complex of monastic buildings, cloisters, chapter house, scriptorium, dormitories, etc. It also had a monastic garden and a cemetery. Slowly, the full picture of the friary is being uncovered, and the artefacts found shed light on the daily lives of the community here and of the people of Trim. And I'm in front of St. Joseph's Community Nursing Unit in Trim. It's on the site of what once was Trim Workhouse, and it includes some of the main block of the workhouse which still exists. The Poor Relief Ireland Act of 1838 led to the establishment of poor law unions, and one for Trim was established in 1839. These built workhouses, and Trim Workhouse was built in 1841 and opened in 1842. It cost £6,790 to build. It was built to house a maximum of 500 patients from Trim and from the surrounding areas. Of course, the Great Famine soon occurred, and it resulted in massive overcrowding in Trim Workhouse and in all workhouses. By the end of 1848, when the famine was raging, the number of patients in the workhouse had risen to 756. The Sisters of Mercy took over the nursing care of those in the workhouse infirmary in 1884, and the institution remained under their care until 1996. When the Free State was established in 1922, Trim Workhouse became the county home for County Meath. Over the years it was maintained, and in 1970 it was extensively renovated and extended and reopened as St. Joseph's Home. The then Minister for Health, who was later President of Ireland, Erskine Childers, performed the official opening. It's now St. Joseph's Community Nursing Unit and provides a range of care options for older people in Meath. Behind me is Highfield House, a very nice guest house in Trim, with a great view of the River Boyne, Trim Castle and the Yellow Steeple. But it wasn't always a guest house. Older Trim residents will remember this building as Trim Maternity Hospital, and indeed many of them may have been born there. My wife and son were both born there. I'm not sure when it was built, but probably in the 1840s or 1850s, when the poor law system was being set up, and workhouses and hospitals of various kinds were being built. It's just across the road from what was Trim Workhouse, and that was opened in 1841. The building was used as a maternity hospital, and when the state was founded, it became the County Maternity Hospital for Meath. It remained so until 1983, when it was closed. During those years, there were many campaigns to have it upgraded and refurbished, and some reconstruction and modernisation was carried out in 1957-1958. By the late 70s, its use had declined. Many mothers opted instead to go to the better equipped hospitals in Dublin and Drogheda. In 1977, what was then the North Eastern Health Board set up a committee to investigate the viability of the unit as a long-term service. The conclusion of this committee was that the hospital should be closed. There was a strong local campaign to have it retained and upgraded, but this failed. And Trim Maternity Hospital was finally closed on the 1st of March 1983. Here I am in front of what's known sometimes as the Model School, sometimes as the Brothers, and sometimes as Boyne Community School. In 1831, the national school system was set up in Ireland, and as part of that system, model schools were set up under the direct control of the National Board of Education in order to help train teachers for the schools. Model schools were built in 13 Irish towns, including Trim. And this one here was begun in 1849 and opened in 1850. It was non-denominational, and it was supported by the rector at the time, the famous Richard Butler, and by the parish priest, Father John O'Connell. In 1870, the Royal Commission on Education recommended that the model schools be closed. And so Trim, like all the others, became an ordinary, locally managed national school. In 1946, the Christian Brothers arrived in Trim, took over the model school, refurbished it at the cost of £16,000 and opened it in 1947 as a new secondary school. When the Christian Brothers left Trim, it became St. Michael's Diocesan School. Then in 2001, this school was amalgamated with Trim Vocational School to become the present Boyne Community School. Behind me is the 6-metre high sculpture called King and Queen by the artist Ronan Halpin. It's on the Trim bypass, and it was commissioned by Meath County Council as part of the Percent for Art scheme when the bypass was being built. It was erected in 1992. The artist was obviously inspired by nearby Tara, traditionally the seat of the High Kings of Ireland, and I suppose also by Trim Castle, which was visited by a King of England, King John, in 1210, though he didn't actually get into the castle and had to rest outside in tents. Richard II also came, and he did stay in Trim Castle in 1399. I don't think any of the Queens of England visited Trim, but Prince Charles, who presumably will be the next King of England, did visit Butterstream Gardens in Trim in 1995. The sculptor Ronan Halpin was born in Drogheda in 1958, and he studied at the National College of Art and Design in Dublin and at the Yale School of Art in the United States. He has had many exhibitions across Ireland and abroad. These bronze sculptures are very impressive, but it does seem that the positioning isn't the best. Because of where they don't really stand out, like many other similar sculptures do throughout the country. Also, the trees close by regularly threaten to cover them. Here I am in front of Trim Hardware Store, which some of our more senior viewers may remember was the Royal Cinema Trim once upon a time. The Royal Cinema was opened on Friday the 3rd of September 1948. The first feature film was called Escape, starring Rex Harrison and Peggy Cummings, with a Laurel and Hardy short. Seat prices for the opening night range from balcony 2 shillings and 2 pence to front stalls 1 shilling. And just by way of comparison, in the same year, 1948, the Meath Chronicle cost 2 pence. The Royal Cinema was built and operated by James Gary, a native of Athboy, who also operated the cinema in Athboy. He had been showing films in Trim Town Hall since about 1936. He lived in Trim, and he was a member of Trim Urban District Council. He died in June 1953 at a young age, 56, and his cinemas were taken over by his two daughters. His daughter Peggy was married to pharmacist Paddy Fay in Trim, and she ran the Royal Cinema Trim. It eventually closed in February 1975 and was sold in April of the same year for £13,250. Behind me is one of the new landmarks of Trim, the headquarter building of the Office of Public Works, the OPW. This was officially opened in April 2010 by the then TD and Government Minister Noel Dempsey. You might remember that this was part of Government Minister Charlie McCreevy's decentralisation programme. The four-storey building cost in the region of €37 million. It's circular in shape, which is a reference to some of the monuments of Meath, Newgrange, Knowth and Doubt. There's a civic plaza to the front, and the building was intended to create a focal point for a proposed new Trim town centre, which hasn't yet been implemented. The building covers over 8,000 square metres and caters for over 350 staff. It took 2 years to complete, was designed by OPW architects and constructed by Bennett Construction, Mullingar.
This is my town. No, I don't believe that the grass could be greener on any other ground. This is my town.